Every dog owner knows that moment when you realize your faithful companion is getting older, and you tell yourself it's just part of life. For Frank Morrison, watching his golden retriever Daisy develop a small lump under her neck felt like another gentle reminder that they were both slowing down together after his wife's passing 3 years ago. Frank figured it was just extra weight from too many treats and lazy afternoons. Daisy still wagged her tail, still greeted him at the door, still seemed like the same loving dog who had helped him through his darkest days. But when she started sleeping more and eating less, something told Frank to take her to the vet. What? The doctor found inside that innocent-looking lump would change everything Frank thought he knew about his beloved companion. How could he have missed the signs that Daisy was fighting for her life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window of Frank Morrison's modest two-story home on Maple Street, casting golden streaks across the worn linoleum floor where Daisy's food bowl sat, still half full from the night before. At 67, Frank had developed a routine as predictable as the sunrise itself, and that routine had revolved around his golden retriever for the past 3 years, ever since Margaret had drawn her last breath in the upstairs bedroom. Leaving Frank to navigate a world that suddenly felt too quiet and too large, Frank stood at the counter, watching the coffee maker gurgle to life, his weathered hands wrapped around his favorite mug, the one Margaret had given him 20 years ago with "World's Best Husband" painted in fading blue letters. The irony wasn't lost on him now. Had he been the world's best husband? The question had haunted him since that terrible day when the doctor told him Margaret's persistent cough hadn't been just allergies after all. "Morning, girl," he murmured to Daisy, who lay curled on her favorite braided rug near the back door. Her golden coat, once lustrous and thick, had grown softer and slightly grayer around her muzzle, mirroring Frank's own salt and pepper hair. She lifted her head at his voice, her amber eyes still bright with the unconditional love that had carried Frank through his darkest months. The house bore the comfortable marks of a life well lived. Margaret's touch lingered everywhere, in the handmade curtains she'd sewn for the kitchen window, in the carefully tended houseplants that Frank now struggled to keep alive, in the family photos that lined the mantelpiece above the fireplace. Their wedding picture sat prominently in the center, showing two young faces full of hope and dreams they couldn't have imagined would span 43 years. That Frank's daily routine had become a form of meditation, a way to honor Margaret's memory, while finding purpose in each ordinary moment. He'd wake at 6:30, shower, and dress in the same flannel shirts and comfortable jeans he'd worn for decades, then make coffee strong enough to fuel a construction crew, a habit Margaret had always teased him about. "One day that coffee's going to wake the neighbors," she used to say, shaking her head with affectionate disapproval. After breakfast, which consisted of toast and whatever fruit wasn't going bad in the refrigerator, Frank would clip Daisy's leash to her collar and they'd set out for their morning walk. These walks had become the highlight of both their days. Frank would nod to Mrs. Patterson as she watered her prize-winning roses 3 houses down, wave to young Tommy Chun riding his bicycle to catch the school bus, and exchange pleasantries with whoever else was starting their day in their quiet neighborhood. The route never varied. Down Maple Street to Oak Avenue, left toward the small park where children played on weekends, then back through the residential streets that Frank had called home for 30 years. Daisy would trot beside him with the enthusiasm of a dog half her age, stopping to investigate interesting smells and greeting other dogs with the social grace Margaret had always admired. "She's got better manners than most people," Margaret used to observe, watching Daisy politely wait her turn at the park's water fountain while more aggressive dogs pushed ahead. In the afternoons, Frank would retreat to his garage workshop, where he'd taken up woodworking as a way to keep his hands busy and his mind occupied. The smell of sawdust and wood stain provided a comforting backdrop to his thoughts, and Daisy would curl up on an old blanket in the corner, content to watch him work. He'd talk to her while he sanded and shaped pieces of oak and pine, sometimes about Margaret, sometimes about their son Michael who lived 3 states away, sometimes just about the weather or what they might have for dinner. Michael called every Sunday at 2 o'clock sharp, a ritual they'd established after Margaret's funeral when it became clear that Frank was struggling with the isolation. These conversations followed a predictable pattern. Michael would ask about Frank's health. Frank would insist he was fine. Michael would mention wanting to visit soon, and Frank would change the subject to ask about Michael's job at the engineering firm or his latest dating adventures. "Dad, you know I worry about you being alone in that big house," Michael had said during their last conversation. "I'm not alone," Frank had replied, scratching behind Daisy's ears. "Besides, your mother always said this house was meant to be lived in, not treated like a museum." The truth was more complicated. Frank had grown comfortable with his solitude, but it was Daisy who had made the difference between being alone and being lonely. She provided structure to his days, a reason to get out of bed each morning, and a warm presence that filled some of the silence Margaret had left behind at Dr. Sarah Chun had been their veterinarian for 8 years, ever since they'd moved to the practice on Mill Street when their old vet retired. She was a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and gentle hands that both Frank and Daisy trusted implicitly. Margaret had especially appreciated Dr. Chen's patience in explaining medical conditions and treatment options, never talking down to them or rushing through appointments. "Animals are family," Dr. Chen had told them during one of Daisy's routine checkups. "They deserve the same careful attention we'd give any family member." Frank had carried those words with him, especially after Margaret's death, when Daisy became not just a pet, but his primary companion. He'd been religious about her annual checkups, her vaccinations, her dental cleanings, all the preventive care that Dr. Chun recommended for senior dogs. The neighborhood around Maple Street had remained remarkably stable over the years. The Pattersons had lived in their corner house for 25 years, raising 3 children who now visited with grandchildren during holidays. Mrs. Patterson, a retired school teacher with silver hair and an endless supply of casseroles for neighbors in need, had become Frank's unofficial guardian angel since Margaret's passing. "Frank Morrison, you're getting too thin," she'd announce, appearing at his door with covered dishes and maternal concern. "Margaret would have my hide if I let you waste away to nothing." These interactions had become precious to Frank, reminders that he wasn't as alone as he sometimes felt. The neighborhood represented continuity, a place where people looked out for each other and where a man and his dog could find peace in simple routines. That Frank's relationship with technology remained complicated. He'd mastered the basics: email to stay in touch with Michael, a flip phone for emergencies, and a small television for evening news and weather reports. Margaret had been the one who embraced change, who suggested they try new restaurants or take weekend trips to explore different towns. Without her gentle prodding, Frank had settled into patterns that felt safe and familiar. The first signs of Daisy's declining appetite had been so gradual that Frank initially dismissed them. A few kibbles left in her bowl one morning, a lack of enthusiasm for her favorite training treats, a tendency to sleep a little longer each day. These changes seemed like natural parts of aging, the kind of slowing down that Frank recognized in himself. His own relationship with doctors and medical care had grown increasingly complicated since Margaret's death. The specialist who had failed to catch her lung cancer early enough, the oncologist who had delivered the devastating news with clinical detachment, the endless appointments that had ultimately led nowhere. All of these experiences had left Frank with a deep skepticism about medical intervention. When his own doctor had suggested routine screenings and follow-up appointments, Frank had politely declined. "I feel fine," he'd insisted, though he hadn't felt truly fine since Margaret died. The truth was that Frank had lost faith in the idea that early detection and aggressive treatment guaranteed better outcomes. Margaret's illness had taught him that sometimes the medical system created more suffering than healing. This skepticism extended to his care for Daisy, though he wouldn't have admitted it at the time. When she'd started showing subtle changes in behavior and appetite, Frank had chosen to interpret these signs through the lens of natural aging rather than potential illness. It felt more hopeful, more manageable than considering alternatives that might lead to difficult decisions and painful treatments. The garage workshop had become Frank's sanctuary, a place where he could lose himself in the meditative rhythm of measuring, cutting, and sanding. His projects had grown more ambitious over the months. Small jewelry boxes for Margaret's nieces, birdhouses for the backyard, a new bookshelf for the living room, where Margaret's romance novels still occupied 3 full shelves. Working with his hands reminded Frank of his father, a carpenter who had taught him that good craftsmanship required patience and attention to detail. Measure twice, cut once, his father used to say, and Frank had found wisdom in that philosophy that extended beyond woodworking. As evening approached each day, Frank and Daisy would settle into their final routine. Frank would prepare a simple dinner, often something Margaret would have disapproved of, like canned soup and crackers or a sandwich eaten standing at the kitchen counter. Daisy would receive her evening meal and medications. Then they'd retire to the living room where Frank would read while she dozed at his feet. These quiet hours represented peace to Frank, a sense that despite all the losses and changes, some things remained constant. Daisy's steady breathing, the familiar creaks of their old house settling for the night, the comfort of books and memories. These elements created a cocoon of contentment that made the future seem manageable. But change, as Frank was about to learn, rarely announces itself with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives in small, easily dismissed signs that accumulate slowly until denial becomes impossible. The lump under Daisy's neck had been growing for weeks, maybe months, before Frank finally acknowledged its presence. And even then, his first instinct was to hope it would resolve itself, to avoid the complications that medical attention might bring. Margaret's garden journal sat in a kitchen drawer, its pages filled with her careful observations about plant care and seasonal changes. Frank had discovered it while looking for batteries one afternoon, and reading her notes about tending to living things had stirred something uncomfortable in his chest. Margaret had been the nurturer in their relationship, the one who noticed when houseplants needed water or when Daisy seemed under the weather. Without Margaret's attentive eye, Frank realized he might have developed blind spots, areas where his natural tendency toward denial and avoidance could put Daisy at risk. The thought scared him more than he wanted to admit, but not quite enough to overcome his reluctance to seek medical opinions that might complicate their peaceful routine. The lump, when Frank finally acknowledged it, felt like a small, soft mass beneath the golden fur of Daisy's neck. It moved slightly when pressed, and Daisy showed no signs of pain or discomfort when Frank examined it. These observations reinforced his hope that whatever was happening wasn't serious, that time and patience would prove more effective than expensive veterinary interventions. Frank's evening conversations with Daisy had become more frequent and more intimate over the months. He'd tell her about his concerns for Michael's future, his regrets about things left unsaid to Margaret, his fears about growing older alone. Daisy would listen with the kind of attention that humans rarely offered. Her amber eyes focused on Frank's face as if she understood every word. "You're all I've got now, girl," he'd whispered to her on more than one occasion, scratching behind her ears in the spot that made her tail wag. "We need to take care of each other." These words would return to haunt Frank in the days ahead, when he realized that taking care of someone sometimes meant facing uncomfortable truths rather than clinging to comfortable hopes. The first morning Daisy refused her breakfast, Frank stood at the kitchen counter, holding her food bowl, staring down at his golden retriever with growing concern. For 8 years, since she was a puppy, Daisy had approached mealtime with the enthusiasm of a dog who believed each bowl might be her last. She would dance in small circles while Frank prepared her kibble, tail wagging so hard her entire back end would wiggle with anticipation. But this Tuesday morning in October, Daisy remained curled on her rug by the back door, lifting her head politely when Frank called her name, but showing no interest in the familiar sound of kibble hitting ceramic. The lump under her neck seemed more prominent in the morning light, and Frank noticed for the first time how she held her head at a slightly awkward angle, as if something was causing discomfort. "Come on, girl," Frank coaxed, setting the bowl down beside her usual feeding spot. "You need to eat something." Daisy's amber eyes met his with an expression that seemed almost apologetic. She rose slowly from her bed, approached the bowl with none of her usual enthusiasm, and sniffed delicately at the food before turning away with disinterest. The sight sent a chill through Frank's chest that had nothing to do with the October air seeping through the kitchen windows. Frank knelt beside Daisy, his arthritic knees protesting against the cold linoleum floor, and gently examined the lump under her neck. What had felt like a soft, movable mass just days earlier now seemed firmer, more defined. When he pressed lightly against it, Daisy pulled back slightly, not in pain, exactly, but with clear discomfort. The memory of Margaret's final months crashed over Frank like a wave. How many signs had he missed then? How many times had Margaret mentioned feeling tired, experiencing shortness of breath, or having that persistent cough that they'd both attributed to allergies? The doctors had assured them that early detection made all the difference. Yet by the time they'd finally insisted on a chest X-ray, Margaret's cancer had already spread beyond hope. Frank pushed the memory away and focused on the present moment. This was different. Daisy was different. Dogs didn't get lung cancer from years of secondhand smoke. Dogs didn't hide their symptoms behind brave smiles and reassurances that everything was fine. Dogs were honest about their pain in ways that humans often weren't. The mailman's arrival typically sent Daisy into a frenzy of protective barking, a daily ritual that had provided comic relief during Frank's darkest months after Margaret's death. But when the familiar sound of the mail truck rumbled down Maple Street that morning, Daisy barely lifted her head. Frank watched through the kitchen window as postal worker Eddie Rodriguez walked up their front path, glancing toward the door, with obvious surprise at the absence of Daisy's usual territorial display. Even Eddie noticed. Frank murmured to himself, a knot of worry tightening in his stomach. By afternoon, Frank could no longer pretend that Daisy's behavior was within the normal range of aging-related changes. She had slept through lunch, ignored the treat he'd offered during their abbreviated walk, and shown no interest in the tennis ball that usually guaranteed at least a few minutes of enthusiastic play. The golden retriever who had been his constant companion for 3 years seemed to be retreating from the world, conserving energy for something Frank didn't want to contemplate. The decision to call Dr. Chen's office felt like admitting defeat, acknowledging that his careful routine and wishful thinking weren't sufficient to protect Daisy from whatever was happening inside her body. Frank sat at Margaret's old desk in the living room, the veterinary clinic's number written on a sticky note that had been attached to the refrigerator for months, and struggled with what felt like a betrayal of his own coping mechanisms. Margaret had always been the one to make medical appointments, to ask the difficult questions, to push for answers when something didn't feel right. Without her advocacy, Frank had learned to avoid situations that might require him to navigate complex medical decisions or face unwelcome truths about mortality and suffering. Dr. Chen's office. This is Jessica speaking. How can I help you? The receptionist's cheerful voice cut through Frank's hesitation, forcing him to articulate his concerns aloud for the first time. This is Frank Morrison. I need to schedule an appointment for my dog, Daisy. She's been. Frank paused, searching for words that would convey his worry without sounding hysterical. She's been off her food for a couple of days, sleeping more than usual. There's a lump under her neck that seems to be getting bigger. Jessica's tone immediately shifted to professional concern. How long have you noticed the lump, Mr. Morrison? Few weeks, maybe longer, Frank admitted, feeling foolish for not calling sooner. I thought it might just be age, a little extra weight. But now with the other symptoms. Dr. Chen's next available appointment is Thursday at 2 o'clock. Would that work for you? Thursday felt like an eternity away. Frank glanced at Daisy, who was still lying motionless on her rug, and realized that 2 days might represent a significant decline if her condition was progressing rapidly. Nothing sooner, he asked, hating the note of desperation that crept into his voice. Let me check if we have any cancellations tomorrow, Jessica said, and Frank could hear computer keys clicking in the background. Actually, we did have someone. Reschedule. We could fit Daisy in tomorrow at 3:30 if that's better. Yes, Frank said immediately. Tomorrow at 3:30. Thank you. After hanging up the phone, Frank sat in Margaret's chair and studied Daisy's sleeping form. The afternoon light streaming through the living room windows highlighted the gray around her muzzle and the slightly labored quality of her breathing. How long had these changes been developing? How many subtle signs had he rationalized away? In his determination to maintain their peaceful routine, the evening routine that had provided comfort for months now felt charged with anxiety. Frank prepared Daisy's dinner with the same care as always, but watched with growing alarm as she approached the bowl listlessly and ate only a few bites before returning to her bed. The amount of food she consumed wouldn't sustain a cat, much less a 70-pound golden retriever. Sleep eluded Frank that night. He lay in the bed he'd shared with Margaret for 4 decades, listening to Daisy's breathing from her bed in the corner of the room. Every pause in her respiration sent a jolt of panic through his chest, memories of Margaret's final nights flooding back with unwelcome clarity. He'd listened to Margaret struggle for breath in those last weeks, helpless to ease her suffering. Watching cancer steal her strength one labored breath at a time at T3 in the morning, Frank gave up on sleep and padded downstairs to check on Daisy. She was awake, lying with her head raised, looking toward the window as if watching for something in the darkness. When she saw Frank, her tail managed a weak wag, the first sign of her old enthusiasm he'd seen in days. "Can't sleep either, girl," Frank whispered, settling into Margaret's recliner where he could watch over Daisy without disturbing her rest. The hours until dawn passed slowly, punctuated by Frank's worried observations of every small change in Daisy's condition. Her breathing seemed slightly easier when she held her head in certain positions. The lump under her neck appeared more pronounced when she lay on her side. Her eyes tracked Frank's movements with alert intelligence, as if she understood that something significant was happening but trusted him to make the right decisions. That by morning, Frank's resolve had crystallized into determination. Whatever was wrong with Daisy, he would face it head-on rather than allowing fear and avoidance to potentially compromise her care. Margaret's illness had taught him that denial didn't change medical realities, only delayed necessary interventions that might make a difference. The car ride to Dr. Chen's office had always been one of Daisy's favorite adventures. She would press her nose against the passenger window, watching the familiar neighborhood give way to the commercial district where the veterinary clinic occupied a converted house on Mill Street. But as Frank helped her into the passenger seat of his aging Toyota Camry, Daisy showed none of her usual excitement about the journey. "We're going to figure this out," Frank told her, adjusting the air conditioning to keep her comfortable. "Dr. Chun will know what to do." The words were as much for his own reassurance as for Daisy's, a mantra against the growing fear that he might be about to lose the one family member who had helped him survive the loss of all the others. Dr. Sarah Chen's examination room felt smaller than Frank remembered, the fluorescent lighting casting harsh shadows across the stainless steel table where Daisy lay with uncharacteristic stillness. Frank had expected the familiar warmth of their routine visits, the easy conversation about Daisy's diet and exercise while she wagged her way through a standard checkup. Instead, he found himself gripping the plastic chair beside the examination table, watching Dr. Chen's face for clues about what her careful hands were discovering. "The mass is definitely larger than what we'd expect from simple weight gain," Dr. Chen said, her voice maintaining the professional calm that Frank had always appreciated but now found unsettling. "I can feel distinct edges to it, and it seems to be attached to deeper tissue rather than just sitting in the subcutaneous layer." Frank's medical vocabulary had expanded during Margaret's illness, and he understood enough to know that attached to deeper tissue wasn't encouraging news. "What does that mean exactly?" Dr. Chun continued her examination, gently manipulating the lump while Daisy tolerated the attention with patient resignation. "It could be several things: a cyst, an abscess, a growth, or even a foreign object that's caused an inflammatory response. The X-rays will help us determine what we're dealing with." The mention of X-rays sent Frank's mind racing to financial calculations he hadn't anticipated. Margaret's medical expenses had depleted their savings significantly, and Frank's pension, while adequate for his simple lifestyle, didn't include a budget for extensive veterinary procedures. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him. After avoiding his own medical care to save money, he now faced the prospect of expensive treatment for the one family member he couldn't bear to lose. 20 minutes later, Frank sat in the waiting room while Daisy underwent imaging, the familiar sounds of the clinic, barking dogs, mewing cats, the cheerful chatter of staff members, providing a soundtrack to his growing anxiety. He'd called Michael from the parking lot, their first unscheduled conversation in months. "Dad, what did the vet say?" Michael's voice had carried the same worry that Frank felt, the shared understanding that Daisy represented more than just a pet in Frank's carefully reconstructed life. "We're doing X-rays now," Frank had explained. "Dr. Chen thinks it might be something more serious than we hoped. Do you need me to come home? I can take some time off work." The offer had touched Frank more than he'd expected, but he'd declined. Michael had his own life to manage, a demanding job that required frequent travel relationships that Frank didn't want to disrupt with his problems. Let's see what the x-rays show first. No point in you driving 8 hours until we know what we're dealing with. When Dr. Chun returned with the films, her expression had shifted from professional concern to something approaching alarm. She clipped the x-ray images to the light board in the examination room, and Frank found himself staring at shadowy shapes that meant nothing to his untrained eye. There's definitely a foreign object lodged deep in the tissue, Dr. Chen explained, pointing to a dark line that appeared to extend several inches into Daisy's neck. It looks like a piece of wood, possibly a stick or thorn that penetrated the skin during a walk and broke off. The surrounding tissue shows signs of chronic inflammation and possible infection. Frank stared at the x-ray, trying to comprehend how something so apparently simple could have created such a complex medical situation. How long has it been there? Based on the inflammatory response we're seeing, probably several months. Dogs are remarkably good at hiding pain, and golden retrievers especially tend to maintain their happy demeanor even when they're uncomfortable. The guilt hit Frank like a physical blow. Several months. How many walks had they taken where Daisy might have been suffering in silence? How many times had he interpreted her slightly slower pace or decreased enthusiasm as normal aging rather than signs of a serious medical condition? What do we do now? Frank asked, his voice sounding smaller than he'd intended. Dr. Chen's expression softened. Surgery is the only option to remove the foreign object and address the infection. It's not a simple procedure. We'll need to go quite deep to extract whatever's lodged in there. And there's always risk involved with anesthesia for older dogs. The word risk hung in the air between them, carrying implications that Frank wasn't ready to confront. After Margaret's death, he'd sworn to himself that he wouldn't put another family member through aggressive medical interventions that might cause more suffering than healing. Yet looking at Daisy's trusting eyes, he realized that avoiding treatment wasn't protecting her. It was protecting himself from having to make difficult decisions. What happens if we don't do the surgery? Dr. Chen's Paws told Frank everything he needed to know before she spoke. The infection will continue to spread. Daisy's already showing signs of systemic illness, the decreased appetite, lethargy, reluctance to move. Without intervention, her condition will deteriorate rapidly. Frank spent the drive home in silence, Daisy sleeping fitfully in the passenger seat while he processed the information Dr. Chun had provided. The estimated cost of surgery, nearly $3,000, represented a significant portion of his emergency savings. More concerning than the money was the risk assessment Dr. Chun had carefully explained. At Daisy's age, anesthesia carried inherent dangers. The surgery itself was complex, requiring careful navigation around vital structures in her neck. Yet, the alternative was unthinkable. Frank had already lost Margaret to a disease that had progressed beyond treatment options. He couldn't passively watch Daisy deteriorate from a condition that might be fixable, simply because he was afraid of making the wrong choice. That evening, Frank sat at his kitchen table with a calculator and his bank statements, working through financial scenarios that would allow him to proceed with Daisy's surgery. He could defer some home maintenance projects, reduce his grocery budget, maybe sell some of Margaret's jewelry that he'd been saving for no particular reason. The money existed, it would just require adjustments to his carefully managed retirement lifestyle. Mrs. Patterson's knock on his front door interrupted his calculations. She stood on his porch holding a covered casserole dish, her silver hair catching the porch light and her expression reflecting the maternal concern that had helped Frank through many difficult days. "I saw you come home from the vet clinic this afternoon," she said, stepping into his living room without waiting for an invitation. "How's our Daisy doing?" Frank found himself explaining the diagnosis to Mrs. Patterson, grateful for the opportunity to articulate his fears and concerns to someone who understood the significance of Daisy in his daily life. Mrs. Patterson listened, with the patience of a retired teacher, asking practical questions about recovery time and post-surgical care that Frank hadn't thought to discuss with Dr. Chen. "You know Margaret would never forgive you if you let financial worries stop you from helping Daisy," Mrs. Patterson said gently, settling into Margaret's recliner with the familiarity of a longtime neighbor and friend. The truth of her words settled over Frank like a comfortable blanket. Margaret had never hesitated to spend money on medical care for their family, viewing health expenses as investments in the people and animals they loved. She would have scheduled Daisy's surgery immediately, then figured out the financial details later. Surgery is scheduled for Friday morning, Frank said, the decision feeling both terrifying and inevitable. Dr. Chin wants to do blood work first to make sure Daisy can handle the anesthesia. Mrs. Patterson nodded approvingly. I'll plan to check on you both during her recovery. It'll be good for me to have something useful to do. As Frank prepared for another sleepless night, he reflected on how quickly his careful routine had been disrupted by circumstances beyond his control. 3 days ago, his biggest concern had been whether to plant tulip bulbs before the first frost. Now he faced the possibility of losing Daisy to a condition that had been developing under his nose for months. The foreign object lodged in Daisy's neck had become a metaphor for all the dangers that could hide beneath surface appearances. Frank wondered what other threats he might be missing through his determination to maintain peaceful routines and avoid complications that required difficult decisions. The night before Daisy's surgery, Frank found himself unable to settle into any meaningful activity. He'd attempted to read, tried watching the evening news, even considered working on the half-finished birdhouse sitting in his garage workshop. Nothing could quiet the anxious thoughts circling through his mind like buzzards over roadkill. At 11 o'clock, he gave up on sleep entirely and decided to search for Daisy's pet insurance documents. Paperwork that Margaret had organized with her characteristic attention to detail. The filing cabinet in Margaret's study had remained largely untouched since her death, a shrine to her methodical approach to household management. Frank pulled open the drawer labeled medical/insurance and began sorting through manila folders filled with Margaret's careful handwriting. Veterinary records, vaccination certificates, health insurance policies they'd maintained throughout their marriage. All evidence of a life lived with preparation and foresight. Tucked between a folder of old tax returns and Margaret's final medical bills, Frank discovered an envelope addressed to him in Margaret's familiar script. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, recognizing the deliberate blue ink of her favorite fountain pen, the one he'd given her for their 20th wedding anniversary. My dearest Frank, the letter began, and Frank could almost hear Margaret's voice speaking the words as he read. If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're probably struggling with decisions I used to help you make. I know how much you hate dealing with medical situations, how they remind you of losing your father, and all the ways doctors can disappoint us when we need them most. Frank lowered the letter, his chest tight with emotions he'd spent 3 years trying to manage. Margaret had written this during her final weeks, when pain medication made writing difficult and every task required enormous effort. Yet she'd found strength to address concerns about his future that extended beyond her own suffering. I've been thinking about Daisy, the letter continued, and how much she'll mean to you when I'm not there to remind you that loving someone means facing difficult truths sometimes. You have a tendency to avoid problems until they become impossible to ignore. It's one of the things I love about your optimistic nature, but it worries me too. Frank remembered Margaret's illness with painful clarity now. How many times had she mentioned feeling unusually tired? How often had she dismissed her persistent cough as seasonal allergies? Frank had been all too willing to accept her reassurances, preferring hope to the anxiety of medical consultations that might deliver unwelcome news. When Daisy needs medical care, and she will, because all living things do eventually, please don't let your fear of loss prevent you from fighting for her. She'll depend on you to make the hard choices, just like I depended on you during my illness. I know you feel guilty about not pushing me to see doctors sooner, but sweetheart, we both participated in that denial. What matters now is learning from our mistakes. The letter went on for 2 more pages, covering practical matters like insurance, policies, and account numbers. But Frank found himself returning to Margaret's words about making hard choices. She'd known him well enough to predict exactly how he would respond to Daisy's medical crisis, with the same reluctant avoidance that had characterized his approach to his own health issues. Margaret had concluded the letter with a memory from their early years together, when they'd brought home a stray kitten they'd found injured beside the highway. Frank had wanted to wait and see if the kitten would recover on its own, worried about veterinary expenses they could barely afford as newlyweds. Margaret had insisted on immediate treatment, arguing that love required action rather than wishful thinking. That little gray kitten lived with us for 14 wonderful years, Margaret had written. Smokey never would have survived without surgery to repair his broken hip, but we never regretted the money we spent or the sleepless nights we invested in his recovery. Love isn't just a feeling, Frank. It's a commitment to do whatever is necessary to protect the creatures who depend on us. Frank folded the letter carefully and placed it in his shirt pocket, feeling Margaret's presence more strongly than he had since her funeral. Her words provided clarity that cut through his anxiety about Daisy's surgery. The financial cost, the medical risks, the potential for heartbreak. All of these concerns paled beside the simple truth that Daisy needed his advocacy and protection at dawn. Frank called Michael to share the contents of Margaret's letter. His son listened without interruption, understanding the significance of their mother's final guidance about caring for Daisy. "Dad, I've been thinking about this situation all night," Michael said when Frank finished reading excerpts from the letter. "I want to help with the surgical costs. Daisy means as much to me as she does to you. She's family." Frank felt tears threatening for the first time since receiving Daisy's diagnosis. "Son, you don't need to." "Yes, I do," Michael interrupted. Firmly. "Mom always said family takes care of family, and that includes four-legged family members. Besides, I've been looking at my vacation time, and I realized I could work remotely for a few weeks if you need help during Daisy's recovery." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, father and son planning logistics and sharing concerns about Daisy's prognosis. Frank found comfort in Michael's practical questions about post-surgical care and rehabilitation, the same methodical approach that Margaret had brought to medical crises throughout their marriage. After hanging up the phone, Frank spent the morning preparing his house for Daisy's return from surgery. He moved her bed to the living room where he could monitor her more easily, researched information about post-surgical nutrition for dogs, and prepared a notebook to track her recovery progress, something Margaret would have done automatically. The drive to Dr. Chin's clinic felt different from their appointment 3 days earlier. Frank no longer approached the visit with dread and uncertainty. Margaret's letter had reminded him that love required courage, and Daisy deserved his best effort to secure her treatment regardless of his own fears about medical procedures and their potential outcomes. "We're going to get through this," Frank told Daisy as they sat in the clinic parking lot, gathering courage for the next phase of their journey together. "Your grandma Margaret taught me that avoiding difficult decisions doesn't protect the people we love, it just delays the help they need." Daisy's amber eyes met his with the trust that had sustained Frank through 3 years of grief and loneliness. Whatever happened in the operating room today, Frank knew he was finally making the choice that Margaret would have made. The choice that put Daisy's welfare ahead of his own emotional comfort. Dr. Chin's pre-surgical examination confirmed that Daisy was stable enough for anesthesia, though her blood work showed signs of the systemic infection they'd expected. The foreign object would need to be removed soon, before the inflammation spread further into surrounding tissue. "Surgery should take about 2 hours, Dr. Chin explained as Frank signed the consent forms. "I'll call you when she's awakened." Stable. Frank kissed the top of Daisy's head and whispered a promise that he would be waiting when she needed him most, just as Margaret had waited for him during the darkest moments of his own life. The 2 hours Dr. Chun had estimated for Daisy's surgery stretched into 3, then 4, with Frank pacing the clinic's waiting room like an expectant father from a bygone era. He'd exhausted the selection of outdated magazines, memorized the patterns in the linoleum floor, and struck up conversations with other pet owners that revealed the universal anxiety of people who love their animals more than they'd ever expected. When Dr. Chin finally emerged from the surgical suite, her scrubs were stained with evidence of the complex procedure she'd just completed. Frank read her expression before she spoke, relief and concern warring across her features in a way that suggested both good news and complications. "The surgery went well," Dr. Chin began, settling into the chair beside Frank with the careful movements of someone who had been standing for hours. "But what we found was more extensive than the X-rays suggested." She opened a small specimen jar and showed Frank the object that had been threatening Daisy's life for months. A blackthorn twig nearly 2 inches long, its surface covered with tissue that had grown around the foreign invader. Frank stared at the innocuous-looking piece of wood, struggling to comprehend how something so small could have caused such hidden devastation. Blackthorn is particularly dangerous because of the bacteria it carries, Dr. Chin explained. The wood had been in Daisy's neck for at least 4 months, maybe longer. Her body had been fighting a continuous infection all this time, which explains her gradual decline in energy and appetite. Frank felt the weight of guilt settle over him like a lead blanket. For months, how many subtle signs had he missed during that time? How many opportunities had he squandered to address Daisy's condition before it required such invasive treatment? The good news is that we were able to remove the entire object and clean out all the infected tissue, Dr. Chin continued. Daisy tolerated the anesthesia well, and she's waking up now. But Frank, I need you to understand. This was touch and go for a while. The infection had spread further than we anticipated, and there was some damage to surrounding muscle tissue. Frank's medical vocabulary had expanded during Margaret's illness, and he understood the implications of muscle damage in a senior dog. What does that mean for her recovery? She'll need several weeks of restricted activity while the surgical site heals. Antibiotics for at least 10 days to clear the remaining infection. Physical therapy might be helpful once the initial healing is complete. Dr. Chen paused, her expression growing more serious. Frank, I want you to know that if you'd waited much longer to bring her in, we might not have been able to save her. The words hit Frank like a physical blow, confirming his worst fears about the consequences of his avoidance. Margaret's letter had warned him about his tendency to delay difficult decisions, but hearing how close he'd come to losing Daisy through procrastination made the lesson painfully personal. 20 minutes later, Frank knelt beside Daisy in the recovery area, watching her struggle to emerge from anesthesia with the disoriented confusion of someone waking from a deep dream. Her neck was wrapped in white bandages that made her look fragile and vulnerable, so different from the confident, energetic dog who had been his constant companion for 3 years. Hey, girl, Frank whispered, stroking the soft fur behind her ears, one of the few places he could touch without interfering with her surgical site. You did great. You're going to be fine now. Daisy's amber eyes found his face with effort, her tail managing a weak wag that nearly brought Frank to tears. Even emerging from major surgery, drugged and disoriented, she was trying to reassure him that everything would be okay. The generosity of her spirit, the unconditional love she continued to offer despite his failures to protect her adequately, humbled Frank in ways that made him reconsider everything he thought he knew about caregiving and responsibility. The drive home required careful navigation of every pothole and speed bump, Frank hyper-aware of how each small jolt might affect Daisy's healing surgical site. She dozed fitfully in the passenger seat, her breathing shallow but steady, occasionally lifting her head to check that Frank was still beside her. Mrs. Patterson was waiting on Frank's front porch when they arrived, armed with a thermos of coffee and a grocery bag filled with supplies she'd researched for post-surgical pet care. Her presence reminded Frank that he wasn't facing Daisy's recovery alone. A support network had emerged around their crisis that extended beyond his immediate family. How did she do? Mrs. Patterson asked, helping Frank create a comfortable recovery area in the living room using extra pillows and blankets. Frank explained Dr. Chin's findings about the blackthorn and the extent of infection that had been silently threatening Daisy's life. Mrs. Patterson listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that medical details mattered, asking practical questions about medication schedules and dietary restrictions that Frank hadn't thought to discuss with Dr. Chun. You know, Frank, Mrs. Patterson said as they watched Daisy settle into her makeshift bed, Margaret always said that love isn't about being perfect. It's about learning to do better when we know better. You couldn't have known about that thorn, but you acted as soon as you realized something was seriously wrong. Her words provided comfort that Frank wasn't ready to accept fully. The guilt about his delayed response to Daisy's symptoms felt too fresh, too connected to his regrets about Margaret's illness, to be easily dismissed by rational reassurance. That evening, Frank established the routine that would govern their lives for the next several weeks. Daisy's medications, antibiotics, and pain management needed to be administered every 8 hours. Her surgical site required twice-daily cleaning and inspection for signs of infection. Her food and water intake needed monitoring to ensure she was getting adequate nutrition during recovery, Frank created a notebook to track Daisy's progress, documenting her temperature, appetite, energy levels, and any changes in her condition. The methodical approach felt like honoring Margaret's memory while ensuring that he wouldn't miss important signs during Daisy's vulnerable recovery period. Michael called that evening to check on the surgery results and offer encouragement about Daisy's prognosis. Their conversation covered practical matters like medication schedules and follow-up appointments. But Frank found himself sharing his guilt about the delayed diagnosis and his fears about what other problems he might be missing through inattention or avoidance. "Dad, you can't protect everyone from everything," Michael said gently. "What matters is that you got Daisy the help she needed when you realized how serious things were. Mom would be proud of how you handled this crisis." As Frank settled onto the living room couch for his first night of monitoring Daisy's recovery, he reflected on how drastically his life had changed in just 1 week. The comfortable routine that had sustained him for 3 years had been replaced by the demanding schedule of medical caregiving, a role he'd hoped never to assume again after Margaret's death. Yet watching Daisy sleep peacefully for the first time in weeks, her breathing easy and unlabored, Frank felt something beyond relief. The blackthorn that had threatened her life was gone, removed by skilled hands and careful attention to detail. The infection that had been slowly poisoning her system was being addressed with appropriate medication. For the first time in months, Daisy's body could focus on healing rather than fighting a battle she couldn't win alone. Frank's small spiral notebook quickly became the most important object in his house, its pages filling with careful observations about Daisy's recovery that would have made Margaret proud. Temperature readings, medication times, food consumption, measurements, behavioral notes, all recorded in Frank's methodical handwriting that grew more confident as he embraced his role as Daisy's primary caregiver. Day 3 post-surgery, Frank wrote on Monday morning. Temperature normal at 101.2 degrees. Ate half portion of breakfast with appetite, tail wagging when I approached her bed. Surgical site clean, no redness or swelling. Pain medication given. At 7 a.m. The routine that had once revolved around leisurely walks and unstructured companionship now followed the precise schedule that serious medical recovery demanded. Frank set his alarm for every 8 hours to ensure Daisy received her medications on time, even during the night. He learned to recognize subtle signs of discomfort that might indicate pain or infection, becoming fluent in the language of canine recovery that he'd never expected to need. Dr. Chin had warned Frank that Daisy's healing would be gradual, with setbacks and plateaus that would test his patience and resolve. On the 4th day after surgery, Daisy seemed unusually lethargic and showed little interest in the scrambled eggs that had become her favorite recovery food. Frank's anxiety spiked immediately, his mind racing to worst-case scenarios about surgical complications or medication reactions. The phone call to Dr. Chin's office revealed how much Frank's perspective on medical care had evolved. Instead of avoiding contact with healthcare providers, he now viewed them as essential partners in Daisy's recovery. Dr. Chin reassured him that fluctuations in energy and appetite were normal during the first week, but she praised Frank's detailed observations and encouraged him to continue monitoring Daisy closely. "You're doing everything right," Dr. Chin told him. "Daisy is lucky to have someone paying such careful attention to her recovery." The compliment meant more to Frank than Dr. Chun could have known. For the first time since Margaret's death, he felt competent in a caregiving role, capable of providing the kind of attentive care that could make a meaningful difference in someone's health outcomes. Mrs. Patterson's daily visits had evolved into a support system that extended beyond simple neighborly concern. She brought meals that Frank actually remembered to eat, helped him organize Daisy's medication schedule, and provided the kind of emotional encouragement that sustained him through the most anxious moments of recovery. "You know, Frank," she said during her Thursday afternoon visit, "I lost my Charlie to cancer 5 years ago. A golden retriever, just like Daisy. I always wondered if I'd missed signs, if I'd been too slow to get him proper care." Frank looked up from his notebook, where he'd been recording Daisy's improved appetite that day. Mrs. Patterson rarely talked about her late husband or the pets they'd lost over the years, preferring to focus on present concerns rather than past regrets. "The guilt doesn't really go away," she continued, settling into Margaret's recliner with the familiarity of someone who had earned her place in Frank's support system. But I've learned that beating ourselves up for what we didn't know doesn't honor the love we were trying to express. What matters is how we respond when we do understand what's needed. Her words resonated with Frank's evolving understanding of his own journey through Daisy's medical crisis. The guilt about delayed diagnosis would probably always ache in quiet moments. But Mrs. Patterson was right. The energy he spent on self-recrimination could be better invested in ensuring Daisy received the best possible care going forward. By the end of the first week, Daisy's improvement had become undeniable. Her appetite had returned with enthusiasm that reminded Frank of her puppy years. She was moving around the house with increasing confidence, though still restricted from stairs and vigorous activity. Most encouraging of all, her personality was emerging from the haze of illness and pain medication that had dulled her spirit for months. "Look at this," Frank wrote in his notebook on Friday evening. "Daisy brought me her favorite tennis ball today. First time she's shown interest. In play since before surgery. Didn't try to engage her in actual play due to activity restrictions, but the behavior suggests significant improvement in energy and mood." The detailed observations had become more than medical documentation. They were Frank's way of honoring the lesson Margaret's letter had taught him about paying attention to the creatures who depended on his care. Each entry in the notebook represented his commitment to never again miss important signs of illness or distress. Michael's weekend visit provided an opportunity for Frank to demonstrate how dramatically his approach to medical caregiving had evolved. His son arrived expecting to find his father overwhelmed by the responsibilities of post-surgical care, but instead discovered a man who had embraced the role with competence and dedication that surprised them both. "Dad, you've become a pretty impressive nurse," Michael observed, watching Frank administer Daisy's evening medications with practiced efficiency. "Mom would be amazed to see how organized you've gotten with all this medical stuff." Frank showed Michael the detailed records he'd been keeping, explaining how he'd learned to interpret Daisy's subtle signals about pain levels and comfort. The notebook had become a bridge between his old tendency to avoid medical complexity and his new commitment to mastery of whatever knowledge Daisy's care required. "I've been thinking about my own health too," Frank admitted as they sat in the living room, watching Daisy sleep peacefully in her recovery bed. "Dr. Chen mentioned that I should consider scheduling my own checkup. Apparently, avoiding doctors for 3 years isn't the wisest approach to preventive care." Michael's surprise was evident, but he managed to hide his amazement behind careful encouragement. "That sounds like a good idea, Dad. When was your last physical?" "Before your mother got sick," Frank admitted. "I guess I figured if I felt okay, there wasn't much point in looking for problems. But watching Daisy struggle with that infection, that was invisible to me. It's made me realize that early detection really can make a difference." The conversation continued long into the evening, father and son planning not just Daisy's continued recovery, but Frank's gradual re-engagement with the kind of proactive healthcare that Margaret had always advocated. The notebook that had started as a way to track Daisy's post-surgical progress had become a symbol of Frank's broader commitment to paying attention to himself, to the people and animals he loved, to the subtle signs that something might need care before it became a crisis. As Michael prepared for the drive back to his own life on Sunday afternoon, he pulled Frank aside for a conversation that had been building throughout the weekend. "Dad, I've been doing some thinking about my work situation," Michael said. "I've got enough seniority to request a transfer to the regional office here. It would mean taking a small pay cut, but I'd be close enough to help if you need anything." Frank's initial instinct was to discourage such a sacrifice, to insist that he was managing fine on his own. But Daisy's medical crisis had taught him that accepting help wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a practical recognition that caring for others sometimes required community support. "What about your life there? Your friends, the woman you've been dating?" Michael smiled. "Sarah and I have been talking about this too. She's a nurse, Dad. She thinks moving closer to family is exactly the right choice, especially now that you're dealing with medical stuff. Besides, this area could use another engineering firm, and I've always wanted to try working for myself." The possibility of having Michael nearby felt like an unexpected gift, a reminder that family connections could strengthen rather than weaken during times of crisis. Frank found himself imagining a future where Daisy's recovery marked the beginning of a new chapter rather than simply the resolution of a medical emergency. 3 weeks into Daisy's recovery, Frank arrived at Dr. Chin's office for what he expected to be a routine follow-up appointment, his notebook filled with encouraging observations about Daisy's steady improvement. Her appetite had returned completely. Her energy levels were approaching normal, and the surgical site had healed cleanly, without signs of infection. Frank felt cautiously optimistic that their ordeal was drawing to a successful close. Dr. Chin's examination began with the same thorough attention that Frank had come to appreciate. But as she listened to Daisy's heart and palpated her abdomen, her expression shifted from routine professionalism to focused concern. She repeated several parts of the examination, her movements becoming more deliberate and careful. "Frank, I'm seeing some things that concern me," Dr. Chin said, settling into her chair with the measured tone that Frank had learned to recognize as preparation for difficult news. Daisy's surgical site has healed beautifully, and the infection from the blackthorn is completely resolved. But her blood work shows some abnormalities that weren't present during her pre-surgical testing. Frank felt his stomach drop, the familiar sensation of medical ground shifting beneath his feet that had become all too familiar during Margaret's illness. "What kind of abnormalities?" Dr. Chin pulled up the lab results on her computer screen, pointing to numbers that meant nothing to Frank but clearly troubled her professional assessment. "Her white blood cell count is elevated, but not in a pattern consistent with bacterial infection. Her protein levels are unusual as well. Most concerning is that her recovery has been slower than we'd expect for a dog her age with this type of surgery." The words hung in the air between them, carrying implications that Frank wasn't ready to process. "What does that mean exactly?" "It could indicate an autoimmune condition," Dr. Chun explained carefully. "Something that might have made her more susceptible to the severe infection from the blackthorn and could affect her long-term health management. I'd like to run some additional tests and possibly consult with a veterinary internal medicine specialist." Frank stared at the computer screen showing Daisy's lab results, trying to reconcile this news with his careful observations of her apparent recovery. How could she seem so much better while harboring a condition that might threaten her future health? "Is this," Frank paused, struggling to articulate his fear. "Is this something that could have been prevented if I'd brought her in sooner?" Dr. Chin's expression softened with understanding. "Frank, autoimmune conditions aren't caused by delayed treatment. If that's what we're dealing with, it would have developed regardless of when you sought care for the blackthorn. The important thing is that we're identifying it now, when we can develop a management plan." The drive home felt surreal, Frank's mind racing through implications he wasn't prepared to consider. After weeks of careful recovery monitoring, after feeling competent and successful in his caregiving role, this new possibility felt like a cruel reversal of all his efforts. Daisy sat in the passenger seat with her usual contentment, unaware that her future had just become complicated in ways that Frank couldn't yet understand. That evening, Frank called Michael with the news, struggling to explain how their apparent success story had suddenly developed unexpected complications. "Dad, let's not panic until we know what we're dealing with," Michael said, his engineering mind immediately shifting into problem-solving mode. Autoimmune conditions in dogs can often be managed effectively with proper treatment. The important thing is that Dr. Chin caught this early. Michael's practical response helped ground Frank's swirling anxieties, but couldn't completely alleviate his growing sense that he was facing another long-term medical journey just when he'd thought their crisis was resolving. Mrs. Patterson's reaction to the news revealed depths of support that Frank hadn't fully appreciated. She arrived at his door the next morning with research printed from her computer about canine autoimmune conditions, treatment options, and success stories from other pet owners who had navigated similar diagnoses. "My sister's dog lived 8 wonderful years with an autoimmune condition," she told Frank as they sat at his kitchen table reviewing the information she'd gathered. "It required ongoing medication and regular monitoring, but Buster had a full, happy life right up until the end." Frank appreciated her efforts to provide encouragement, but found himself struggling with the prospect of indefinite medical management after hoping that Daisy's surgery would restore their simple, uncomplicated routine. The appointment with Dr. Rodriguez, the veterinary internal medicine specialist, was scheduled for the following week. In the meantime, Frank found himself hyper-aware of every small change in Daisy's behavior. searching for signs that might indicate the progression of an autoimmune condition he didn't yet understand. "She seems tired after our short walks," Frank wrote in his notebook. "But is this normal post-surgical fatigue or something more concerning? Appetite remains good, but should I be worried about the slightly slower eating pace?" The detailed observations that had provided comfort during Daisy's initial recovery now felt charged with anxiety about their implications. Frank realized he was developing the kind of medical hypervigilance that had characterized Margaret's final months, when every symptom carried the weight of potential catastrophe. Michael's decision to accelerate his plans for relocating took on new urgency with Daisy's evolving medical situation. He called Frank on Thursday evening with news that felt like a lifeline in turbulent waters. "I've given my notice at work," Michael announced. "Sarah and I are planning to move back in 6 weeks. We found a house just 10 minutes from you, and Sarah's already been in touch with the local hospital about nursing positions." Frank's first instinct was to protest, to insist that Michael shouldn't disrupt his life for problems that Frank should be able to handle independently. But Daisy's medical crisis had taught him to recognize when situations exceeded his capacity for solo management. "Son, are you sure about this? If Daisy has a chronic condition, we could be looking at years of ongoing medical care." "Dad, that's exactly why we want to be closer," Michael replied firmly. "Family takes care of family, remember? Besides, Sarah's excited about the idea of helping with Daisy's care. She's worked with a lot of patients who have chronic conditions, and she says the key is building a good support team." The conversation continued for an hour, father and son planning the logistics of Michael's relocation while acknowledging the uncertainty that Daisy's diagnosis had introduced into all their futures. Frank found himself grateful for Michael's practical approach to problem solving, the same methodical thinking that Margaret had brought to family crises throughout their marriage. Dr. Rodriguez's comprehensive evaluation confirmed Dr. Chen's suspicions about an autoimmune condition, though the specific diagnosis would require additional testing to determine the most appropriate treatment protocol. The specialist explained that autoimmune conditions in senior dogs could often be managed effectively with medication and careful monitoring, but required ongoing commitment to medical care that would extend for the rest of Daisy's life. "The good news is that we caught this relatively early," Dr. Rodriguez told Frank as they reviewed the treatment options. "With proper management, many dogs with autoimmune conditions live normal lifespans and maintain good quality of life." Frank listened to the detailed explanation of immunosuppressive medications, dietary modifications, and regular monitoring that would become part of their new normal. The complexity felt overwhelming, but he thought about Margaret's letter and her words about love requiring action rather than wishful thinking. "What do we do first?" Frank asked, his notebook ready to record the beginning of another chapter in their medical journey. Dr. Rodriguez smiled at Frank's readiness to engage. "With the treatment plan, we start with a moderate dose of immunosuppressive medication and schedule follow-up appointments every 2 weeks initially to monitor her response. The goal is to find the right balance that controls her autoimmune activity while maintaining her overall health." As Frank drove home with Daisy and a bag of new medications, he reflected on how dramatically his relationship with medical complexity had evolved over the past month. The man who had avoided doctors for 3 years was now coordinating care between multiple veterinary specialists, managing complex medication schedules, and planning for long-term chronic disease management. The plot twist of Daisy's autoimmune diagnosis had transformed what Frank hoped would be a simple recovery story into something more challenging and uncertain. But it had also revealed reserves of competence and dedication that he hadn't known he possessed, capabilities that might serve him well in whatever medical challenges lay ahead for both of them. The comprehensive treatment plan that Dr. Rodriguez developed for Daisy's autoimmune condition filled 3 pages of detailed medical protocols that would have intimidated Frank just 2 months earlier. Now, as he studied the medication schedules, dietary restrictions, and monitoring requirements, he approached the complexity with the methodical determination of someone who had learned to view medical challenges as problems to be solved rather than disasters to be endured. Prednisone 10 milligrams twice daily for 2 weeks, then reduced to 5 milligrams twice daily, Frank read aloud to Daisy as she lay in her favorite spot by the kitchen window. Azathioprine 25 milligrams every other day, given with food to reduce stomach upset. Weekly, blood draws for the first month to monitor liver function and white blood cell counts. The medication management alone required a level of organization that Frank had never applied to his own healthcare, but he found satisfaction in creating systems that would ensure Daisy received optimal treatment. He prepared a medication chart for the refrigerator, set multiple phone alarms for dosing times, and established a relationship with the pharmacy technician who would be preparing Daisy's prescriptions for the foreseeable future at Michael's arrival. With Sarah for their house hunting weekend provided Frank with his first opportunity to meet the woman who would become part of their extended medical support team. Sarah Chun, no relation to Dr. Chun, despite the coincidental surname, was a pediatric nurse whose experience with chronic disease management in children translated remarkably well to veterinary care. The principles are really the same, Sarah explained as she reviewed Daisy's treatment plan with the professional eye of someone accustomed to complex medical protocols. Consistency with medications, careful monitoring for side effects, and maintaining quality of life while managing the underlying condition. Frank watched Sarah interact with Daisy, noting her gentle confidence in handling a patient whose cooperation couldn't be assumed. She demonstrated techniques for pill administration that minimized stress, explained how to recognize early signs of medication side effects, and suggested modifications to Frank's monitoring system that would provide better data for the veterinary team. "You've done an incredible job with her recovery," Sarah told Frank as they organized Daisy's medical supplies in the kitchen. "Michael showed me the notebook you've been keeping, and honestly, most of the families I work with don't maintain that level of detailed observation." The compliment meant more to Frank than Sarah could have known. For the first time since Margaret's death, he felt genuinely competent in a caregiving role, capable of providing the kind of attentive medical management that could make a meaningful difference in someone's health outcomes. The financial reality of long-term autoimmune treatment required careful planning that extended beyond Frank's initial emergency fund calculations. Immunosuppressive medications for dogs carried ongoing costs that would impact his retirement budget indefinitely, and the regular monitoring appointments represented a recurring expense that he needed to integrate into his financial planning. Mrs. Patterson's practical assistance extended to helping Frank research pet insurance options that might cover some of Daisy's ongoing medical expenses. Together, they spent an afternoon comparing coverage plans and calculating potential savings, an exercise that reminded Frank how much his perspective on medical spending had evolved. Margaret always said that money spent on health was an investment. In the future, Mrs. Patterson observed as they reviewed insurance documents. Besides, what's the point of having savings if you don't use them for the things that matter most? Frank's appointment with his own physician, the first in 3 years, felt like a natural extension of the medical vigilance he'd developed through Daisy's care. Dr. Williams, his longtime family doctor, expressed surprise at Frank's decision to schedule a comprehensive physical examination but didn't probe the reasons behind his sudden interest in preventive health care. "Your blood pressure is a bit elevated," Dr. Williams noted during the examination. "When did you last have it checked?" "Before my wife's illness," Frank admitted, realizing that his avoidance of medical care had extended to basic health monitoring that might have prevented problems rather than simply treating them after they became symptomatic. The conversation that followed covered routine screenings that Frank had been avoiding, medication adjustments that might improve his cardiovascular health, and lifestyle modifications that could support his overall well-being as he aged. Frank found himself engaging with these recommendations rather than dismissing them, his experience with Daisy's medical care having taught him that early intervention generally offered better outcomes than crisis management. "I'd like to see you back in 3 months for follow-up on the blood pressure medication," Dr. Williams said as they concluded the appointment. "And Frank, whatever motivated you to finally come in for this checkup, keep doing it. Prevention is always easier than treatment." Michael's successful job interviews with 2 local engineering firms provided concrete evidence that his relocation plans would proceed smoothly. His decision to start his own consulting practice rather than joining an established firm reflected the same independent thinking that Margaret had always admired, combined with practical recognition that self-employment would offer more flexibility for family caregiving responsibilities. Sarah's already been offered a position at Children's Hospital, Michael told Frank during their Sunday dinner at a restaurant that allowed dogs on the patio. She's excited about the pediatric oncology unit. Apparently, they need nurses with experience managing complex medication protocols. Frank watched Daisy rest peacefully under the table, her energy levels remaining good despite the immunosuppressive medications that would become a permanent part of her daily routine. The normalcy of sharing a meal together, planning for the future, and discussing practical details of daily life felt precious in a way that Frank had learned not to take for granted. The support network that had emerged around Daisy's medical crisis had evolved into something resembling an extended family. Mrs. Patterson had become Frank's unofficial medical coordinator, helping him track appointments and medications while providing emotional support during anxious moments. Dr. Chun remained accessible for questions and concerns, treating Frank as a collaborative partner in Daisy's ongoing care rather than simply a pet owner following instructions. Frank's woodworking hobby had resumed with projects that reflected his changed perspective on time and attention. Instead of the decorative birdhouses and jewelry boxes that had occupied him during his first years of retirement, he now focused on practical items that supported Daisy's medical care. A raised feeding station that reduced strain on her neck, a ramp that allowed her to access the couch without jumping, storage solutions for her various medications and supplies. "You know, Frank," Mrs. Patterson observed as she watched him sand the edges of a new medication organizer. "Margaret would be amazed to see how this crisis has brought out qualities in you that maybe you didn't even know you had." Frank paused in his work, considering the truth of her observation. The man who had spent 3 years avoiding medical complexity was now managing chronic disease treatment with competence and dedication. The widower who had retreated into solitary routines was now part of an active support network that included family, neighbors, and medical professionals working together for Daisy's benefit. The evening routine that had once represented simple companionship now included medical tasks that required attention and precision. Daisy's medications needed to be administered at specific times with careful attention to food interactions and potential side effects. Her energy levels and appetite required daily assessment to detect any changes that might indicate treatment. Adjustments were needed. Yet these additional responsibilities felt meaningful rather than burdensome to Frank. Each successful day of medication compliance, each positive response to treatment, each sign that Daisy's autoimmune condition was being effectively managed represented evidence that careful attention and dedicated effort could make a real difference in health outcomes. That Frank's notebook had evolved beyond simple recovery tracking to become a comprehensive medical record that documented patterns and trends in Daisy's response to treatment. Dr. Rodriguez had praised the detailed observations during their last appointment, noting that Frank's careful documentation provided valuable data for optimizing Daisy's medication protocols. Most pet owners struggle to provide this level of detail about their animal's daily condition, Dr. Rodriguez had told him. "Your records are going to be invaluable for managing Daisy's long-term care." The specialist consultation had also revealed that Daisy's autoimmune condition, while requiring ongoing management, carried a generally positive prognosis with proper treatment. Many dogs with similar diagnoses lived normal lifespans and maintained good quality of life when their medications were carefully managed and their condition was monitored appropriately. As Frank prepared for another evening of medication administration and condition monitoring, he reflected on how completely his life had been transformed by what had started as a simple concern about a small lump under Daisy's neck. The crisis had revealed capabilities he hadn't known he possessed, strengthened family relationships that had grown distant over time, and created a support network that extended far beyond his previous social connections. The treatment plan that Dr. Rodriguez had developed represented both a roadmap for managing Daisy's chronic condition and a testament to how much Frank's approach to medical care had evolved. Where he had once viewed medical complexity as something to be avoided, he now saw it as a set of tools that could be mastered and applied effectively when guided by love and commitment to careful attention. Tomorrow would bring the next phase of their journey together. Ongoing management of a chronic condition that would require vigilance and dedication for the rest of Daisy's life. But Frank no longer approached such challenges with the dread and avoidance that had characterized his response to Margaret's illness. Instead, he felt prepared to provide whatever level of care and attention Daisy's condition required confident in his ability to be the advocate and caregiver that she deserved. 3 months into Daisy's autoimmune treatment protocol, Frank stood in Dr. Chin's examination room holding his breath as she reviewed the latest blood work results. The protective cone that Daisy had worn during her initial recovery had long since been retired, but Frank had kept it in the garage workshop as a reminder of how far they'd both traveled from those first frightening days of medical uncertainty. "These numbers are exactly what we hoped to see," Dr. Chin announced, her smile breaking through the professional reserve that Frank had learned to read like a weather forecast. "Daisy's inflammatory markers are within normal range. Her liver function looks great despite the immunosuppressive medications, and her overall condition is stable." Frank felt a wave of relief wash over him that was almost dizzying in its intensity. 3 months of careful medication management, weekly blood draws, dietary modifications, and anxious monitoring had culminated in this moment of vindication, proof that their collaborative effort was successfully managing Daisy's autoimmune condition. "So the treatment is working?" Frank asked, wanting confirmation that his interpretation of the good news was accurate. "The treatment is working beautifully," Dr. Chin replied, scratching behind Daisy's ears while the golden retriever's tail wagged with the enthusiasm that had been absent during her illness. "We can start spacing out the blood work to every 2 weeks, then monthly if these trends continue." The drive home felt celebratory in a way that Frank hadn't experienced since Margaret's death. Daisy sat in the passenger seat with her head out the window, tongue lolling in the wind, looking like the carefree dog she'd been before the blackthorn infection had threatened everything. Frank found himself taking the long route home, wanting to extend this moment of pure relief and accomplishment that Frank's own doctor visit the previous week had yielded similarly encouraging results. The blood pressure medication that Dr. Williams had prescribed was effectively managing his cardiovascular health, and the routine screenings had revealed no concerning abnormalities. For the first time in years, Frank felt like he was taking proactive steps to protect his health rather than simply hoping problems wouldn't develop. "You know, Mr. Morrison," Dr. Williams had told him during their follow-up appointment, "whatever motivated you to finally engage with preventive health care, it's made a real difference. Your blood pressure is well controlled now, and I'm impressed with how seriously you're taking the medication compliance." The irony wasn't lost on Frank that learning to manage Daisy's medical needs had taught him skills that translated directly to caring for his own health. The same attention to detail, consistency with medications, and proactive monitoring that kept Daisy's autoimmune condition stable could be applied to his own aging body with similar benefits. Michael's relocation had proceeded smoothly, with his new consulting practice already attracting clients impressed by his background with larger engineering firms. Sarah had started her position at Children's Hospital and quickly established herself as a valuable team member in the pediatric oncology unit. Their presence in town had created a support network for Frank that extended far beyond emergency assistance with Daisy's medical care. "Dad, you seem different," Sarah observed during their Sunday dinner together at Frank's house. "More confident, more engaged with everything around you." Frank considered her assessment while watching Daisy play gently with a rope toy, her first interest in play since before her surgery 4 months earlier. Sarah was right. Something fundamental had shifted in his approach to daily life. The man who had retreated from complexity and challenge after Margaret's death had been replaced by someone willing to engage with whatever difficulties arose. "I think Daisy's illness taught me that avoiding problems doesn't make them go away," Frank replied. "If anything, it makes them worse by the time you finally have to deal with them." Mrs. Patterson's friendship had deepened through their shared experience of managing Daisy's medical crisis. She continued her daily check-ins, but these visits had evolved from charitable concern for a grieving neighbor to genuine friendship between two people who enjoyed each other's company. "Frank Morrison, you've become quite the medical expert," she teased as she watched him prepare Daisy's evening medications with practiced efficiency. "Margaret would be proud to see how well you've learned to take care of everything." The mention of Margaret no longer carried the sharp pain of fresh grief that had characterized Frank's first years of widowhood. Instead, he felt connected to her memory through the caregiving skills he'd developed, honoring her legacy of attention and dedication to the health and well-being of their family. Frank's volunteer work at the local animal shelter had begun quietly. A few hours each week helping with basic care tasks and socializing dogs who needed human interaction. But his experience with Daisy's medical journey had made him valuable to other pet owners facing similar challenges. You really helped me understand what questions to ask the vet, a young woman told Frank after he'd spent an hour discussing her dog's recent cancer diagnosis. I felt so overwhelmed by all the medical information, but you made it seem manageable. These conversations reminded Frank that his journey through Daisy's illness had equipped him with knowledge and perspective that could benefit other people facing pet health crises. The fear and confusion he'd experienced during those first veterinary appointments had been transformed into competence and confidence that he could share with others who needed guidance. The evening routine that had once represented simple companionship between a lonely widower and his dog had evolved into something richer and more purposeful. Daisy's medication schedule provided structure to their days, but it was structure built around caring for someone he loved rather than simply filling empty hours. 6 months after Daisy's initial surgery, Frank found himself creating a photo album that documented their journey from crisis to recovery, a project that had started as simple record-keeping but evolved into something approaching a celebration of resilience and growth. The album began with pictures of Daisy during her illness, showing the subtle signs of distress that Frank had initially missed, and progressed through her surgery, recovery, and successful adaptation to life with a chronic autoimmune condition. "Look at this one," Frank said to Michael and Sarah as they gathered around his kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon. The photograph showed Daisy on her first walk after being cleared for normal activity, her tail high and her gait confident despite the ongoing medication regimen that would continue for the rest of her life. The photo album had become more than documentation. It was proof that medical challenges didn't have to define or diminish quality of life when approached with appropriate care and attention. Each image told part of the story of how Frank and Daisy had learned to navigate chronic disease management together, finding ways to maintain joy and companionship despite the complexity of ongoing treatment that Michael's engineering practice had flourished beyond his initial expectations, with several major projects that kept him busy but still allowed flexibility for family time and medical appointments when needed. Sarah's work at the Children's Hospital had provided her with additional insights into chronic disease management that benefited Daisy's care in unexpected ways. "You know, the principles of managing autoimmune conditions are really similar whether you're dealing with pediatric patients or golden retrievers," Sarah observed as she watched Frank organize Daisy's weekly medications. Consistency, careful monitoring, and maintaining normal activities whenever possible. Frank's friendship with Dr. Chun had deepened through their shared success in managing Daisy's complex medical needs. Their monthly checkups had become collaborative, discussions between partners who respected each other's expertise and dedication to Daisy's well-being. "I have to say, Frank, you've become one of our best examples of successful chronic disease management," Dr. Chun told him during a recent appointment. "Other pet owners asked me specifically about how you've handled Daisy's care. Would you be interested in speaking to a support group for owners of dogs with autoimmune conditions?" The invitation to share his experience with other pet owners felt like recognition of how far Frank had traveled from the man who had avoided medical complexity and delayed seeking treatment for problems he didn't want to face. Now he found purpose in helping others navigate similar challenges with greater confidence and knowledge. Frank's volunteer work at the animal shelter had expanded to include counseling for prospective pet owners about the realities of caring for animals with chronic health conditions. His story with Daisy had become a teaching tool for helping people understand that medical challenges didn't disqualify dogs from being wonderful companions. The key is being honest about what ongoing care involves, Frank would tell families considering adoption of older dogs or animals with health issues. "It's not about avoiding problems. It's about being prepared to handle them when they arise." Mrs. Patterson's role in Frank's support network had evolved from emergency assistance to genuine friendship that enriched both their lives. Their daily conversations covered everything from neighborhood news to philosophical discussions about aging, loss, and the rewards of caring for others. "You know, Frank," she said during one of their afternoon coffee sessions, "watching you handle Daisy's illness has taught me things about facing my own health challenges. Charlie always took care of the medical stuff when he was alive, and I've been avoiding my own doctor visits since he died. Frank's influence on Mrs. Patterson's healthcare decisions felt like evidence that the lessons he'd learned through Daisy's illness had applications beyond their specific situation. The skills and confidence he'd developed could benefit others in his community who struggled with similar avoidance patterns or medical anxiety. The financial impact of Daisy's ongoing treatment had been manageable through careful budgeting and the pet insurance coverage that Mrs. Patterson had helped him research. More importantly, Frank had learned that spending money on health care, whether for Daisy or himself, represented investment in future quality of life rather than simply expense to be minimized. I've been thinking about what Margaret used to say about money being a tool rather than an end in itself, Frank told Michael during one of their weekly phone conversations. She was right that there's no point in saving money if you don't use it for the things that matter most. Michael's upcoming marriage to Sarah had brought joy to Frank's life that he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death. The wedding planning included considerations for Daisy's participation as a family member, with accommodations for her medication schedule and energy levels during the celebration. Daisy has to be part of the ceremony, Sarah had insisted when they discussed wedding arrangements. She's the reason Michael and I are together in this town, and honestly, she's become like family to me too. The photo album that Frank continued to update represented more than medical documentation. It had become a visual record of how crisis could strengthen rather than weaken family bonds, how challenge could reveal capabilities that might otherwise remain undiscovered, and how love could motivate learning and growth even in the later stages of life. As Frank added recent pictures of Daisy playing in the backyard, medication-free, for hours at a time between doses. He reflected on how completely his understanding of caregiving had been transformed. The man who had once viewed medical complexity as something to be avoided now approached it as a set of skills to be mastered and applied with dedication and precision. 1 year after Dr. Chun had first shown Frank the X-ray revealing the blackthorn lodged in Daisy's neck, Frank knelt in Margaret's garden, placing a small granite stone marker among the flowers that had somehow survived his inconsistent care. The stone was engraved with simple words that had become his guiding principle. Love means paying attention. Daisy lay beside him in the warm afternoon sun, her golden coat gleaming with health, her medication schedule so routine now that Frank could manage it without consulting the detailed charts that had once felt overwhelming. The memorial stone wasn't just for Margaret, though her memory had inspired the lesson it represented. It was for everyone who had taught Frank that caring for others required more than good intentions. It demanded vigilance, courage, and the willingness to act on difficult knowledge rather than hoping problems would resolve themselves. Dr. Chen's monthly checkups had become routine celebrations of Daisy's continued stability on her autoimmune treatment protocol. The detailed blood work that had once terrified Frank with its implications now provided reassuring confirmation that their collaborative medical management was working exactly as intended. 18 months of stable remission, Dr. Chun had announced during their most recent appointment. This is exactly what successful long-term management looks like. Frank's own health had benefited dramatically from the proactive approach he'd learned through managing Daisy's care. His blood pressure remained well controlled on medication, his routine screenings were up to date, and he'd developed the kind of partnership with Dr. Williams that made medical care feel collaborative rather than intimidating. You know, Frank, Dr. Williams had told him recently, you've become the kind of patient we wish everyone could be, engaged, informed, and consistent with treatment plans. Michael's wedding to Sarah had taken place in Frank's backyard 3 months earlier, with Daisy serving as an honored member of the wedding party, wearing a small flower garland that complemented her medication schedule with characteristic golden retriever dignity. The celebration had marked not just the union of two people Frank loved, but the successful creation of an extended family built around mutual support and shared commitment to caring for each other. Dad, watching you with Daisy through her illness taught me what I want my marriage to Sarah to look like, Michael had told Frank during their father-son dance at the reception. The way you learn to pay attention, to put her needs first, to stick with difficult situations instead of avoiding them. That's the kind of partner I want to be. The newlyweds had settled into a house just 15 minutes away, close enough for daily interaction, but far enough to maintain independence. Sarah's pediatric nursing experience had made her an invaluable consultant for Daisy's ongoing care, while Michael's engineering practice had grown to include several employees and projects that kept him engaged and fulfilled. Mrs. Patterson's own health journey had been transformed by watching Frank's example of proactive medical care. She'd finally scheduled the comprehensive physical examination she'd been avoiding since her husband's death, resulting in early detection of high cholesterol that was now being managed effectively with lifestyle changes and medication. "Frank Morrison, you've become quite the influence on this neighborhood," she'd teased him recently. "Half the people on Maple Street have finally gone to see their doctors because of your example." Frank's volunteer work at the animal shelter had evolved into a formal role as a counselor for families facing pet health crises. His story with Daisy had become a source of hope and practical guidance for other pet owners learning to navigate chronic disease management, surgical decisions, and the financial realities of veterinary care. Mr. Morrison helped us understand that loving our dog meant being willing to try the treatment even though it was expensive and scary. A young couple had told the shelter director after Frank had spent an afternoon helping them process their dog's cancer diagnosis. "We almost gave up because we were so overwhelmed, but he showed us how to break it down into manageable steps." The woodworking projects that filled Frank's garage workshop now reflected his commitment to supporting both human and animal health. Pet feeding stations designed for dogs with mobility issues, medication organizers for elderly neighbors, memorial markers for families who had lost beloved animals. All practical expressions of the caregiving skills he'd developed through Daisy's illness. Frank's notebook, once filled with anxious observations about Daisy's post-surgical recovery, now contained routine documentation of her stable condition along with notes about other projects and relationships that filled his days with purpose. The careful attention to detail that had been born from medical necessity had become a general approach to life that honored Margaret's memory while creating new meaning in his daily activities. The evening routine that had once represented simple companionship between a lonely widower and his dog had evolved into something richer and more complex. Daisy's medications were administered with the precision of a medical professional, but the process was embedded in a larger context of family dinners with Michael and Sarah, volunteer commitments at the shelter, and social connections throughout their neighborhood. Frank sat on his front porch with Daisy beside him, watching the sunset paint their quiet street in golden light. He reflected on how completely his life had been transformed by what had started as a simple lump under his dog's neck. The crisis that he'd initially tried to avoid had become the catalyst for growth, connection, and purpose that he couldn't have imagined during his first lonely years of widowhood. Margaret's love had taught him to care deeply for others, but Daisy's illness had taught him to act on that caring with competence and dedication. The combination had created a life that honored both lessons. One lived with attention to the subtle signs that someone needed help and the courage to provide whatever assistance was required. "You know what, girl?" Frank said softly, scratching behind Daisy's ears as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "Margaret always said this house was meant to be lived in, not treated like a museum. I think we're finally doing that." Daisy's tail wagged against the porch boards, a sound that had become the soundtrack to Frank's contentment. Tomorrow would bring another day of medication schedules and routine monitoring, family commitments, and volunteer work, the ordinary activities that constituted a life well lived. But tonight, in the peaceful quiet of their neighborhood, Frank felt the deep satisfaction of knowing that love, real love, meant paying attention to what mattered most.